Hey everybody, welcome back to JLXP, week 2 of the LCS playoffs, and this is one of the top LCS weekends of the year for me. It's the time of year where we're seeing all 8 playoff teams play. 2 teams will be officially eliminated from the year because playoffs and regional qualifier have condensed into what I guess is called the LCS Championship now, and also on Saturday and Sunday, 2 teams will qualify for Worlds. So I did something different in the 10 thoughts, 4 thoughts, 6 thoughts article this week. It's 4 thoughts because there's 4 playoff matchups. TSM Fly on Thursday, CLG Golden Guardians on Friday, 100 Thieves TL on Saturday, and EG versus C9 on Sunday. I went back a little bit to my roots. It was actually some 2016 video that I did for PTL. It was the first JAT stats and just general stats I pulled on teams towards the end of the year to maybe get a slightly better sense of what the team has done, because so much perception changes week to week. This is a moment where I can kind of zoom out a little bit and see maybe some larger trends of what the teams are doing. So you can check out all the pictures of the stats that I pulled in the article, but I'll basically say a lot of them here as well if you just want to listen to the podcast. So very basic stuff, just total record. What was the team's record in the first round robin? What was the team's record in the second round robin, which just gives a gauge of what type of momentum the team is on. Then what was the team's record against the top 5? And what was the team's record against the bottom 5? Is this a team that only beats bad opponents? Is this a team that excels or gets a lot of upsets against top opponents? This shows that. Then 2 stats that I think need a little bit more definition are early game rating and mid game rating. These are stats you can find on Oracle's Elixir, and I'll kind of explain how they're made. So early game rating is a combination of gold and dragons, and it's taken thousands of games basically into account to give a kind of statistical prediction of, based on this early game state, this team will win this percentage of their games. So a team with a 50 early game rating would be an average, completely neutral early game, which then would mean once you go into the mid and late game, which would be the mid-late rating, they would have a 50% chance of winning that game. So a completely average team would have a 50 early game rating and a 0 mid-late rating, because mid-late rating is the difference in their win percentage of what the early game rating would otherwise predict. So generally that number is much smaller. If it's negative, that means that team doesn't have a great mid-late game. If it's positive, that means that team does well after the early game. The highest early game rating ever, and this is absurdly high, I've never seen anything close to this, was 2020 Spring Cloud9, who had an 85 early game rating, which meant even if they were just average in mid and late game, they would still win 85% of their games. So I'll be using that stat a lot. Hopefully it makes sense. If you don't quite understand it, send me a message on Twitter, YouTube, or Reddit, and I'll try and dive in and explain a little bit more, because that's a really big stat for me that I use fairly often. Then I did one other thing with stats, and I basically checked how streamlined a team is and who the stars are of each team statistically. So I checked who does the highest percentage of a team's damage. I checked who gets the highest percentage of a team's gold. And I also checked who takes the most percentage of a team's CS after the 15-minute mark. So that's somewhat about how the team plays macro, somewhat about who is just getting the gold that is on the map that isn't necessarily tied to kills. If a team is really streamlined, I would expect that to be the same player for all 3. He gets a bunch of farm, he gets a lot of gold from turrets or other mechanisms in the mid game, and also because he's so rich, he should be doing the most damage as well. If you're right in line, that will be the type of player we'll have. So those are the stats that I'm going to use to reset the teams, and now I'm going to go through individual matchups and add some extra thoughts here and there. So Thursday matchup, TSM versus FlyQuest. Definitely a bit of a mismatch on paper, Both teams actually had the same record in the first round robin versus the second round robin. FlyQuest 5-4, TSM 3-6, and FlyQuest was much better against bottom 5 teams. They were 6-2, whereas TSM would have been 4-4. Not much happening in the early game and mid-late ratings of these teams. FlyQuest is very close to that neutral team that I talked about, 50.5% early game rating and a 2.1 mid-late, whereas TSM, since they are a worse team, 43 early game rating and -10 mid-late. So bad early game, but then also even worse results based on what the early game would suggest. The thing that jumped out to me here, though, is Johnson leads FlyQuest in damage percentage, gold percentage, and CS percentage. He is one of only 2 players to lead his team in all 3 categories, the other one being Danny, which I'll get to when they go to the EG matchup. And this kind of made me reassess the way that I look at FlyQuest, because I've been pushing the narrative that this team really needs Takui and Jose Diodo to pop off or they lose, and that it's a mid-jungle team. But one of the things that happens when the mid-jungle is doing well is it enables FlyQuest to maybe play more towards their game plan, which is get Johnson a bunch of gold and then have Johnson carry team fights. Part of this is also he had some really good Twitch games, a really good Jinx game, but I am impressed by these stats. So either that means I've been giving a little bit too much attention to Takui with the fact that he has more player of the games than any other player, and not enough attention to Johnson. And then on the TSM side, Instinct, in the few games that he actually did play, because TSM made a lot of roster changes, so it's a smaller sample size, does get 32.2% of the team's CS post 15 minutes, which is a higher percentage than any other player in the LCS. But he doesn't do the most damage and he doesn't get the most gold. Maple does the most damage. Instinct does get the most gold, but Maple does the most damage. That is not great to see. I feel like what happens a lot of the time is Instinct doesn't have a good laning phase, and then he spends a lot of the mid and late game trying to mop up farm, but then because he's behind early, hasn't been able to convert that into damage. I also think more generally that there is a very small amount of upset potential in this game, because Solo is new to the team, and I think they have looked much better with him. But I wouldn't overreact to FlyQuest losing the last 3 games to TL in the first round of the playoffs, and would still consider them very big favorites here. So my prediction in this series is FlyQuest 3-1. I'm going to go to the next series, which is on Friday, CLG versus Golden Guardians. The trends here are interesting. I didn't, for some reason, put together in my head that CLG actually had a better record in the second round robin than the first round robin, because it was so surprising how well they did in the first round robin, 5-4, but then they were 6-3 in the second. They are very good against bottom 5 teams, 8-2. Golden Guardians, on the other hand, was 1-8 in the second round robin and is 1-9 against the top 5 teams, with that one win coming against Cloud9 in week 1 when Cloud9 was playing without Sven and Berserker. Those aren't good signs. The rest of the stats are also not very good for Golden Guardians. 38.4 early game rating, -10 mid-late rating. Happens when you only win 28% of your games. That's, again, how that stat works. I will say that we ended up spending most of the last podcast talking about CLG, even though it was a CLG versus C9 series where they lost. And it's because they actually really showed up in a big way. One unique thing that I found in these stats with CLG is that Palafox does the most damage, Luger gets the most gold, and Dokla gets the most CS. They're the only team that has a different player in all 3 categories. I think the way I rationalize these stats for CLG is that Palafox deprioritizes his farm very frequently in order to roam and make plays in team fights. And eye test-wise, he has been very good in team fights, and that matches with his damage percentage because he's usually the one fighting. Dokla has an incredibly high percentage of the team CS post 15 minutes, and in some ways you would be disappointed that he wouldn't then have more gold or pump up more damage. But I think the rest of CLG is fighting so often, and Dokla's job is like to make sure the waves don't get out of hand because Palafox is looking for so many teamfight angles. So he's just going to have a really high CS percentage. These stats aren't necessarily good or bad. They just paint a picture of the way a team might necessarily play. So I don't necessarily think Dokla's CS percentage without it translating to damage is a bad thing in this case. On the side of Golden Guardians for the same stats, I will say this one's not great. Stixxay takes the most gold, takes the most CS, but doesn't do the most damage. That's Olive. So I would want Stixxay to be able to step it up more in teamfights. It just means they haven't been able to convert the amount of gold and farm that he's taken into teamfight output. Part of that has been the fact that their late game has been so bad, so they're just not getting good setups for him to hit. But the fact remains that they have a player who has a ton of gold who isn't able to convert. Anyway, I think with the quality of CLG's play last week and the fact that Golden Guardians is rolling in with a 1-8 record in their last 9, this is a sweep. That's my prediction. I'm going CLG 3-0. Next matchup, Saturday, 100 Thieves versus TL. This one, there's a lot of interesting stuff. So 100 Thieves don't have a particularly impressive early game, 52.5. But then their mid-late rating, and this stat has been tracked since the spring split of 2017, is the second highest of all time, 25.3. So that means they're winning 25.3% more than their early game model would predict. Now, part of this, I think, is because they've so heavily drafted for scaling, but it's also the second highest of all time. TL, on the other hand, have the best early game rating in the entire league, 67.1%, but then have a slightly negative mid-late rating. So it's not what you would expect from a team that has so much experience on their roster. You could call them like a boomer team. You think if you're older League of Legends players, it's going to be, okay, your mechanics are declining, but they have this really heady knowledge of how to win games and grind out victories. TL is the opposite. They have the best hands in the league, but the worst cohesion comparatively. They're actually also the only team who has a lower win rate when they have a lead after 15 minutes than their actual win rate, if that stat makes sense. So I think it does paint the picture of the type of team TL and 100 Thieves have been throughout the year. 100 Thieves has been this consistent, strong, late-game team-fighting team that shows cohesion and has consistency, and Team Liquid has been this team that is drafting a lot for early game, but just doesn't show cohesion, too many cooks in the kitchen sort of thing. That is very reflective in these stats. The damage stats, the only interesting thing that pointed out to me here was Bwipo actually leads TL in damage and gold percentage. Han Sama leads them in CS percentage, which I find really interesting because when TL jumped out to that 3-0 start at the start of summer, there were multiple interviews about them saying they wanted to play through Han Sama because he's so good in team fights. Yet that hasn't necessarily worked, and they've looked best when Bwipo is popping off. And in the aggregate, he is the one carrying this team. But Han Sama is still the one getting the priority on the most late-game farm. So they got to reconcile that somehow and commit to the right strategy, I think, if they want to win this series against 100 Thieves. Aside from the stats, I really love the story of 100 Thieves versus TL. They have played against each other so much. Going back to the summer playoffs of 2021, TL beat them in winners bracket finals, then lost to them in the actual finals. They seem to meet every playoffs. The trash talk between them feels more real than it does showy. Because they've met so much in playoffs, actually, like 100 Thieves has played against TL more than they have any other LCS team. So they're consistently on this collision course with each other. So I love the fact that they're playing in this round of the playoffs where winner goes to Worlds and then loser really has to fight their way back up through the loser's bracket. Because we've mentioned it many times throughout this year, but for 100 Thieves, TL, C9, and EG, if any of those teams miss Worlds, it's a disaster. 2 of them will go. after this Saturday, Sunday. 2 of them will have that successful year. The 2 that lose are going to have to fight tooth and nail to knock each other out and get back to it. So this is the most important best of 5 that either 100 Thieves or TL have played this year, in my opinion. I think this game is more important to the 100 Thieves organization than spring finals. I think that's how important Worlds in North America is to these teams and these organizations. They have to go. So it'll be really interesting because when you're a team like TL who has this explosive early game and the ability to create all these leads, but they just haven't put it together, I'm going to throw in a golf analogy because it's the thing that came into my head. That's like scoring potential. If you're hitting the ball really far and getting it close to the pin and then just missing your putts, that's more scoring potential than someone who's scrambling all over the course and then hitting these really great 15-foot and 10-foot putts consistently. Their scorecard's going to look the same, but you're like, damn, if that guy just rolled in a few more putts, he'd crush that other guy. That's how TL has felt a lot of the year. Whereas 100 Thieves has been the team that is just consistently playing really solid in every facet of the game. Not spectacular in any, even though like they're spectacular at scrambling to actually pick up victories. But it makes this matchup really close. Like I think if TL can put it together, they absolutely have the potential to take down 100 Thieves. But the fact that 100 Thieves is 8-1 in their second round robin, have so much playoff experience, and have so much cohesion make me predict them in this series. But I think it's going to be close. I have 100 Thieves 3-2. All right. Last series of the weekend, EG versus C9. EG was 10-0 against the bottom 5 teams, but only 5-3 against the top 5 teams. They also had a better first round robin than second round robin, 8-1 to then 7-2. Cloud9, on the other hand, even though they had to play that tiebreaker just to get into the top 5, were 4-5 in the first round robin, 6-3 in the second round robin. Their early game rating is also slightly better than EG's. EG's 55, C9's 57.8. And the mid-late rating on EG, I said 100 Thieves had the second highest ever. EG has the highest ever. And this is backed up by what we've noticed through the eye test and what I've seen other teams say about EG. It's like they feel the game is close, and then they just get aced in a team fight. And EG has been able to do this so consistently. But I do wonder, kind of in the back of my head, they were 9-9 in spring. They made that great run through playoffs. They're 15-3 in summer, but their early game has been largely the same throughout all of it. So is it that they just flipped a switch and are now this godly teamfight team that you're not going to be able to come back on? Or is it somewhere in the middle? And they've actually just been winning a little bit more, like they're a little bit lucky in summer and we're a little bit unlucky in spring. I'm kind of in that camp because that's like, it's an unprecedented mid-late rating. They're winning 28.3% more of their games than their early game would suggest. Part of that, again, is because of the nearly unprecedented way in which they get gold to Danny. Danny leads the team in damage, gold, and CS. And when you watch their games, there's a lot of mid-games where it does actually look like EG is playing somewhat 4v5. Because Danny is just getting a solo turret, taking an extra wave of farm. Because if he does get his items, he is just that damn good in teamfights. His mechanics are actually insane in teamfights, the way he plays them. I'd say the other guy who's right on par with that, though, is Berserker. Now, Cloud9 doesn't set him up the same way that EG does against Danny, but I would say like C9 is similar to TL in the fact that they have a lot of scoring potential. They have really good players. They have really good hands, but they haven't had that cohesion. And they also have an AD carry who can pump out just as well as Danny can in teamfights. So even though EG is 15-3, I think the upset potential in the series is very real. I'm not shocked if C9 actually pull this off and win this best of 5 to go to Worlds. With that being said, though, Come on. EG's the defending champions. They're 15-3. It is irresponsible to not predict them to win this, but I do have it being close. So I have EG at 3-2. That's it for the 4 matchups. I am really looking forward to this weekend. We're going to see a lot of things unfold. Based on these predictions, it would mean TSM goes home, Golden Guardians goes home. The top 2 seeds would advance to Worlds. It would knock down TL and C9 to the losers bracket. They'd also then have to eventually fight through CLG and FlyQuest, who I have winning already their losers bracket games. And those would be the 4 teams that fight for the final spot in Chicago and the final world spot. So 3 more weeks of playoffs. Hope you enjoyed this episode of, thoughts. Mainly, it was week 2 playoff preview and predictions. So thanks everyone for watching, and I'll see you next time.